Hey, you thought no one knew, did you? I've been drunk in that. I sat in the face bowl and threw up in the toilet.
For 6 years straight, Sanford and Son ruled American television. But behind every scene was a truth no fan ever figured out. What the cast lived through off-screen was something that could never have been written into a sitcom script: Red Foxx's double life. Let me tell you, before the world knew him as Fred Sanford, Red Foxx was already a legend, but not the kind you'd see on primetime television. He was infamous for his raw, raunchy stand-up routines, the kind that packed smoke-filled nightclubs and had audiences crying with laughter over jokes that could never air on network TV. His style was called blue comedy, and it was loaded with explicit language, sharp digs, and no-holds-barred storytelling. This was Fox in his purest form, unapologetic, edgy, and fearless. And that's what makes his transformation into the family-friendly Fred Sanford so fascinating. Fans tuning in every week saw a lovable junk dealer, a character who could charm anyone with his antics, but few realized that the man delivering those laughs had once been too vulgar, even for TV censors. And do you know what makes this double life even more striking is the way Fox balanced it. Because on one side, he was the headliner in Vegas casinos and the after-hours king of raunchy comedy clubs, thriving in the freedom of uncensored humor. On the other side, he was NBC's prime-time darling, carrying a sitcom that became one of the most popular shows in America. These weren't just two roles, they were two completely different worlds, and Fox walked between them with ease. For most actors, one persona overshadows the other, but Red Foxx managed to keep both alive, as if he refused to choose. It wasn't simply about comedy, it was survival. Being black in 1970s Hollywood meant constantly shifting between what white executives demanded and what felt authentic to him. So, Fred Sanford became the family man America loved, while offstage, Fox remained the unfiltered truth-teller who never watered down his act. This balancing act said everything about the paradox of his career, but you won't believe how dark the paradox was. Fox had to play both sides because the system demanded it. On TV, he had to be safe, funny, and lovable. Off TV, he could finally be himself, raw, dirty, and daring. Fans thought they knew him, but the Fred Sanford they adored was only half the story. The other half was Red Foxx, the comedian who built his career on material so explicit that television executives once wanted nothing to do with him. That tension between who he was and who he had to be never disappeared, and it followed him straight onto the set of Sanford and Son. But behind the laughter, there was something even bigger boiling: money. At the height of Sanford and Son's success, Fox was pulling in $35,000 an episode, a massive paycheck for the 1970s. For most actors, that kind of salary would have been the dream, but not for Red Foxx. He wanted more. Specifically, he wanted to out-earn Carol O'Connor, the white star of All in the Family, who was making headlines as one of TV's highest-paid actors. For Fox, this wasn't just about greed, it was about respect. Why should a black comedian carrying one of NBC's biggest shows make less than his white counterpart at CBS? To him, it was a matter of pride and proof that he deserved equal recognition. So what he did next was nothing short of bold. In 1974, the simmering tension finally exploded. Fox staged a walkout, citing health problems as the reason, but in reality, it was a high-stakes move to force NBC's hand. 9 episodes had to be filmed without Fred Sanford, which was unheard of for a sitcom lead. Fans at home didn't know the full story, but behind the scenes, it was chaos. The absence of Fox exposed just how fragile the show's success really was. Sanford and Son without Fred wasn't Sanford and Son at all. NBC tried to play hardball, even suing him for $10 million, but it was a bluff they couldn't afford to carry through. In October of 1991, Red Foxx was in the middle of rehearsals for his brand new sitcom, The Royal Family, a CBS production being pushed forward by none other than Eddie Murphy. It was supposed to be his big return to television after the end of Sanford and Son. On October 11th, in the rehearsal room, Foxx suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. To the people standing around him, this wasn't a shock at first, and do you know why? Obviously, because for years he had played Fred Sanford, the junk dealer with a knack for faking heart attacks, clutching his chest while shouting that famous line, "I'm coming, Elizabeth." The move had become his signature gag. So when he fell that day, castmates and crew thought they were just witnessing the same old bit he had turned into comedy gold. They laughed, waiting for the punchline. But this time, there was no punchline, no rise back to his feet, no sly smile. By the time the reality of the moment set in, it was too late. Red Foxx had suffered a massive heart attack, collapsing on the very stage where he was supposed to lead a new show. The tragic irony was almost unbearable. For 2 decades, audiences had laughed every time he faked those chest pains. Now, when the real thing struck, no one rushed to his side right away. His colleagues hesitated, caught between laughter and confusion, because they had been conditioned to believe that whenever Red Foxx clutched his chest, it was comedy, not crisis. What played out that day has been described as one of the most haunting moments in television history. A man died while acting out, for real, the very thing he had been joking about for years. Hollywood historians still call it one of the most ironic deaths to ever hit the industry. The shock wasn't just about the timing, it was about how deeply the gag had been burned into pop culture. On Sanford and Son, Foxx had pretended to keel over so many times that the audience expected it as a running bit. He had used that gag to bring millions to laughter, and it followed him into every corner of his career. So, when life imitated art in the cruelest way possible, the people closest to him froze, unable to tell the difference between comedy and reality until it was already over. That blurred line between his most famous joke and his final moments is why his death still gets talked about decades later. But while Foxx's death became a tragic cultural headline, what was happening behind the scenes years earlier at Sanford and Son reveals another side of the story that few fans ever knew. The set of the show, which looked like a lighthearted junkyard where a father and son traded jokes, was in fact anything but carefree. Demond Wilson, who played Lamont Sanford, revealed years later that the set had its own dark reality, one of paranoia, fear, and loaded weapons. Guns on set. Wilson admitted in interviews that he never once came to work without carrying a gun. His exact words were chilling. "I never did an episode when I wasn't strapped, and he wasn't the only one." Red Foxx himself also carried a firearm while filming. 2 of the show's central stars, the father and son duo America adored, were armed every single day they went to work. For fans who only knew them as the bickering but loving Sanford family, this revelation completely flipped the narrative. The supposed lighthearted world of Sanford and Son was actually being filmed under a cloud of tension and danger. The need for guns wasn't theater. Believe me, this was the 1970s in Los Angeles, a city wrestling with crime, gang tensions, and racial animosity. Hollywood was not insulated from that. For black actors like Foxx and Wilson, success brought visibility, and visibility brought risk. Being a household name in America didn't mean safety. It meant exposure. The threat of robberies was real. The fear of being targeted because of fame, or because of race, or both, was something they lived with daily. Carrying a gun wasn't posturing. It was survival. And here's where the contrast becomes almost surreal. Millions of people tuned in every week to watch Sanford and Son for its humor, for the chemistry between Fred and Lamont, for the escape of laughter. They saw a junkyard, a few props, and a father-son dynamic that reminded them of their own families. What they didn't see was that the men playing those roles were literally strapped for protection just feet away from the cameras. It wasn't a performance choice. It was the real world bleeding into the make-believe world. This revelation from Wilson doesn't just shock because of the presence of weapons. It shocked everyone because of what it says about the climate of the time. Behind the sitcom's jokes, there was a constant awareness of danger. The same men who were bringing joy to millions had to live with the paranoia that danger might be waiting for them the moment the cameras stopped rolling. The junkyard set, so familiar and safe to fans, was in reality a workplace where its stars never felt entirely secure. DeMond Wilson's story starts long before the world ever knew him as Lamont Sanford, the patient son who kept his junk-dealing father in line. Wilson's life carried a weight that sitcom fame could never fully erase. From 1966 to 1968, he served in the United States Army as part of the 4th Infantry Division. He fought in the Vietnam War, one of the most brutal conflicts of the century, and he didn't return unscathed. He was wounded in combat, a reality that most of his fans never knew when they watched him crack sharp comebacks against Red Foxx on national television. The transformation from carrying a rifle in Southeast Asia to trading barbs on a Hollywood soundstage is one of the most drastic shifts an actor has ever made, and yet Wilson rarely spoke about it at the height of his fame. To millions, he was Lamont. But beneath the surface, he was also a decorated veteran whose scars ran deeper than any sitcom role could reveal. The contrast between the battlefield and the set of Sanford and Son could not have been starker. In Vietnam, Wilson lived under the threat of sudden death. Every day was survival. Back in the United States, he was recast as the voice of reason to a cranky junk dealer standing in a staged Los Angeles junkyard that millions found hilarious. That leap from war zones to laugh tracks is one of the most overlooked aspects of his career. While other actors arrived in Hollywood after years of theater or comedy, Wilson walked onto the set with the experiences of a soldier who had already seen the worst of humanity. It gave him a composure and seriousness that bled into Lamont's character, grounding the humor in a way that audiences connected with, even if they never knew why. But the bond between Lamont and Fred that looked so tight on screen was not always as solid off-screen. In 1977, Red Foxx walked away from the show during another one of his salary battles, and the fallout hit Wilson harder than most realized. The betrayal wasn't just about losing his co-star, it was about how he found out. He didn't hear it from Fox himself. He didn't get a call, a conversation, or even a warning. Instead, he discovered the news in the hallway of NBC from a newscaster. For a man who had played Fred's son for 6 years, the lack of respect cut deep. Wilson later admitted that it stung not only professionally, but personally. He felt abandoned by the man who had become a second father figure on television. The bitterness that moment left behind eventually found its way into Wilson's writing. Years after Sanford and Son ended, he published Second Banana, the bittersweet memoirs of the Sanford and Son years. The very title of the book revealed how he saw his role. Always overshadowed, always the supporting act, never given the recognition he believed he deserved. In its pages, Wilson opened up about the painful truth of being constantly eclipsed by Red Foxx. He admitted his admiration for Foxx, but also wrote candidly about the hurt, the betrayals, and the reality of being treated as secondary. For fans who only knew the smiling Lamont, Second Banana was a rare glimpse into the frustration of an actor who had lived in the shadow of one of television's biggest stars. LaWanda Page's shocking past. While Wilson carried the hidden history of a war hero turned sitcom actor, LaWanda Page carried her own startling past that few fans of Sanford and Son ever suspected. Long before she became Aunt Esther, the Bible-wielding, sharp-tongued sister-in-law who went head-to-head with Fred Sanford, Page was known by a very different name, the Bronze Goddess of Fire. Her act was one of the most daring of its time. She swallowed flames, lit cigarettes with her bare fingertips, and even pressed burning torches against her skin. The performances weren't illusions. They left her burned and scarred, but she kept going because it was how she earned her living. To audiences who only knew her as the pious and judgmental Esther, this past life as a fearless fire eater is almost unthinkable. After leaving the fire stage behind, Page reinvented herself as a comedian. but not the kind of comedian network television was ready for. Her comedy was raunchy, unfiltered, and very much for adults. She tackled subjects of sexuality, religion, and race with a bluntness that shocked audiences. One of her comedy albums, Watch It Sucker, went gold, using Aunt Esther's catchphrase as its title, but filling the track list with jokes that no network censors would have ever allowed. She was crowned titles like the Black Queen of Comedy and carved a career that looked nothing like the straight-laced Aunt Esther that television audiences adored. When Page was first cast for Sanford and Son, producers doubted her. They thought her rough edges and lack of television polish made her unfit for the role. They even discussed letting her go before the show had really taken off. That decision nearly cost the world one of the most iconic characters in sitcom history. But Red Foxx stepped in with the same fiery loyalty he was known for. Foxx and Page had grown up together in St. Louis, childhood friends long before Hollywood ever came calling. When producers wanted her out, Foxx drew a line in the sand. He threatened to walk off the show unless Page stayed. His exact response was blunt and forceful. Hell no. The producers gave in, and because of that moment, Aunt Esther lived on to become one of the most memorable characters of the 1970s. Supporting cast secrets Whitman Mayo became famous as Grady Wilson, the slow-moving, gray-haired best friend of Fred Sanford. But the reality was nothing like the character. When Sanford and Son first hit the air in 1972, Mayo was only in his early 40s, decades younger than the old man he played so convincingly. To pull it off, he based Grady's mannerisms on his own grandfather, down to the walk, the speech, and the posture. What makes Mayo's story even more surprising is the road he took before acting. Between 1951 and 1953, he served in the U.S. Army, adding the discipline of military life to his background. After his service, he spent 7 years as a counselor, working with troubled young boys, a career that had nothing to do with comedy or Hollywood. He worked odd jobs too, picking grapes in fields, working at a dairy, and even spending time as a railroad worker. Then came one of the strangest chapters in his pre-acting life, a year in Mexico playing professional volleyball. That kind of past doesn't line up with the image of the fragile, stooped Grady who shuffled across the junkyard. But it was Mayo's reality. Later, when his time on Sanford and Son was over, he used his experience to give back, teaching acting at Clark Atlanta University and even running his own travel agency. Don Bexley, who played Bubba, was another cast member with a life story that fans rarely knew. Bexley wasn't just a co-star. He was Red Foxx's closest friend for nearly 50 years. Their friendship began long before Sanford and Son was even an idea. By the time Foxx brought him onto the show, Bexley was already a seasoned performer. He worked as an orchestra director, a singer, a dancer, and a comedian. He had even broken barriers by becoming the first black stand-up comic to perform on the Borscht Belt circuit, a series of upscale resorts in New York's Catskill Mountains known for launching comedians' careers. Yet despite his long list of accomplishments, Bexley had never been on television. That changed when Red Foxx personally asked him to join Sanford and Son at the age of 62, giving him his very first TV role. Their bond went far deeper than the show. When Foxx died in 1991, Bexley served as an honorary pallbearer at his funeral, standing beside his old friend one last time. That kind of loyalty and lifelong connection made Bubba's on-screen loyalty to Fred Sanford feel all the more genuine. Nathaniel Taylor, known to fans as Rollo Lawson, Lamont's smooth-talking best friend, also carried a story that went far beyond the lighthearted role. In April of 1986, long after Sanford and Son had ended, Taylor's name made headlines for all the wrong reasons. He was arrested along with his brother on burglary charges. The case involved nearly $200,000 worth of stolen computers and typewriters taken from a sports club in West Los Angeles. The arrest shocked fans who remembered him as the comic relief, the hustler who always got Lamont into trouble, but never did any real harm. The man behind Rollo, however, had stumbled into serious trouble of his own. After his acting career slowed, Taylor shifted gears. He eventually opened a performing arts studio for young people, using his own missteps and his Hollywood experience to mentor the next generation. The change showed a very different side of him, someone determined to guide others away from the same mistakes that had once landed him in trouble. Lynn Hamilton, who played Donna Harris, Fred Sanford's kind-hearted girlfriend, brought a level of calmness to the show that balanced out the chaos of Fred's antics. Her off-screen life, though quieter than some of her co-stars, was filled with its own impressive chapters. She came to Sanford and Son with serious theater experience, including 3 years with the New York Shakespeare Festival. She also appeared in Broadway plays and became a familiar face in other hit series of the time, like The Waltons and Good Times. But perhaps the most remarkable part of her story was her marriage. In 1964, she married poet and playwright Frank Jenkins, and they remained together until his death in 2014. That 50-year marriage was a rare kind of stability in the chaos of Hollywood, especially compared to the personal struggles faced by many of her co-stars. While she may not have been the most scandalous or controversial figure on the show, Hamilton's quiet strength and longevity in both her career and personal life made her stand out in her own way. Salary war with NBC Red Foxx, at the center of it all, embodied the wildest contradictions of fame. At one point in the 1970s, he had forced NBC into paying him one of the highest salaries in television, even securing 25% of the show's net profits. But behind the scenes, his personal finances were in constant chaos. Despite the fortune he made, Fox burned through his money at a staggering rate. He loved flashy cars, multiple houses, and gambling, and the spending caught up with him. By 1983, he was forced to file for bankruptcy. The spiral didn't stop there. In 1989, the IRS seized nearly everything he owned after ruling that he owed $2.5 million in back taxes, penalties, and interest. The man who had fought NBC for more money than Carol O'Connor, of All in the Family, had managed to earn. The man who strutted through Las Vegas, pulling $4,000 a week in his prime, was stripped down to almost nothing. By the time he died in 1991, he was remembered as one of television's greatest comic figures, but financially, he was a man who had lost almost everything. The irony stings even more, considering his most famous role, a junk dealer who constantly joked about being broke, was played by a man who, in the end, actually was. When Sanford and Son premiered in 1972, it was groundbreaking in many ways, but what most viewers never saw was the battle raging behind the camera. NBC stacked its writing room with mostly white writers, men who had never lived in Watts, never walked the streets of South Los Angeles, and yet were tasked with capturing the rhythms, slang, and culture of Black life. The result was dialogue that often felt hollow, exaggerated, and cartoonish. The cast, led by Red Foxx, refused to let those stereotypes stand. Fox and his co-stars would read the scripts and push back, bluntly telling the writers, "Black people don't talk like that." They weren't just nitpicking over lines. They were fighting to keep the show authentic in an era when mainstream television rarely portrayed Black families in any kind of realistic light. These clashes didn't stay small. One of the most infamous moments came during a courtroom scene. The script called for Fred Sanford to use a racial slur, and Red Foxx insisted on delivering it. He argued that he, as a Black man, could use the word in a way that reflected real life, even if it made people uncomfortable. The studio audience responded with roaring applause, seeing the boldness of the moment. But inside NBC's executive offices, panic set in. Network bosses were horrified that such language had made it to air, fearing backlash from advertisers and mainstream viewers. Fox didn't care. To him, the choice wasn't about shock value. It was about honesty. He was willing to risk the wrath of executives if it meant making the characters sound real. That decision turned Sanford and Son into more than just a sitcom. It became a front line in the cultural fight over who got to control the Black voice on television. The show's humor may have seemed simple on the surface, a grouchy father, a long-suffering son, endless junkyard schemes. But underneath, it was layered with the weight of these struggles. Every laugh was built on compromises, arguments, and negotiations over representation. Fox's defiance, along with the cast's insistence on realism, gave the show a sharpness that set it apart from other sitcoms of the time. Where many shows leaned into caricatures, Sanford and Son fought to hold on to something closer to truth, even if that truth was uncomfortable for NBC executives to stomach. But the legacy of Sanford and Son stretches far beyond its writing room battles. For millions of viewers, it was America's laugh factory, pumping out comedy that felt timeless. Yet, behind the curtain, the realities of the cast mirrored their characters in ways that often blurred fiction and truth. Red Foxx carried the same stubborn pride that Fred Sanford flaunted. Demond Wilson, like Lamont, struggled with feeling overshadowed and underappreciated. LaWanda Page's fiery, no-nonsense Aunt Esther reflected the boldness she had carried since her days as the bronze goddess of fire. These weren't just performances. They were extensions of real people carrying real burdens. Fox's career, in particular, was built on contradictions. He was a man of sharp loyalty, willing to put his own career at risk to protect LaWanda Page when producers wanted her gone. He had grown up with her in St. Louis, and he refused to see her discarded by Hollywood. That kind of loyalty was rare, and it explains why their on-screen battles crackled with so much energy. But for every moment of loyalty, there were equally strong flaws: reckless spending, constant battles with networks, and clashes with co-stars. His friendships were real, but so were the betrayals and the financial meltdowns. The untold truth of Sanford and Son isn't just the scandals, the guns on set, or the salary walkouts. It's the reality that this sitcom, dressed up as lighthearted junkyard comedy, was actually breaking barriers while hiding some of the most painful costs of fame. Costs of fame. Costs of fame. Costs of